Mineral Point, Wisconsin seems like an ordinary place to grow up. One of the state's oldest cities, this Midwestern town is home to many examples of quintessential Americana. However, it's also the resting place of one of the most notorious otherworldly beings to ever walk the earth. Today on Scream to Screen, we uncover the secret history of Spring-Heeled Jack, the Wisconsin vampire. But first, subscribe to Graveyard Shift for more horror content than you know what to do with. And drop a comment down below and let us know what you want to find out more about next. Colloquially dubbed the Mineral Point Vampire, the unknown being first appeared to stalk the rural suburbs of the Wisconsin city in 1981. Garbed in all black with a lanky, almost inhumanly tall physique, this creature has given individuals from all over the state nightmares for generations. The sightings of the paranormal nocturnal carnivore have been semi-consistent, from its discovery of the mid-'80s all the way up until 2008. In many cases, police officers responded to resident complaints only to uncover evidence that the cryptid shared many common attributes with the classic vampires of the international legend. Of course, Mineral Point police have a long history of hearing about things that go bump in the night, but very few of those reports turn out to be as substantially credible as these. Believe it or not, Mineral Point is also the home to the Ridgeway Phantom, a wailing headless specter who uses fire and brimstone to seek revenge. Here is where you can also find the Haunted Walker House, a long-abandoned bed and breakfast that is home to some of Wisconsin's most feared undead. Urban legends are not a new thing to the American heartland. The wide open plains and sprawling acres of empty real estate can often inspire even the most level-headed individual into seeing bizarre and ultimately unreal things. Still, witness accounts of the Wisconsin vampire are shockingly similar, in spite of the fact that some of these cases took place decades apart. One thing that may support the idea that the Wisconsin vampire is a real-life creature is the fact that each witness provides a consistent description of the cryptid in question. Considering the 23-year gap between the first and second sightings, it seems highly unlikely that this is just a case of one story influencing another. In 1981, a witness claims to have seen a tall, thin, pale, and imposing caped figure roaming the fields of Mineral Point at night. This figure was said to move in an otherworldly, stilted fashion, its legs appearing to be jerking, pulling sinew and bone into a deeply human way. Police responded to multiple reports of this character stalking the Graceland Cemetery on the evening of March 14, 1981. Of those dispatched to handle it, only one officer managed to spot the tall, thin man. He moved closer, immediately noticing that the gaunt individual looked deeply unwell and seemed to have blood-red eyes. But that was all he could gather before the figure, realizing it had been seen, bolted away. The officer gave chase, but the encounter ultimately ended with the pale man leaping over a 6-foot fence at the border of the cemetery. The next morning, the police returned to the cemetery to follow the tracks that the vampire had made in the fresh Wisconsin snow, but they stopped right at the fence. Bizarrely, the snow on the other side, where the culprit would have landed, was utterly undisturbed. The police organized a widespread manhunt, but discovered nothing. This cemented the idea of a lurking vampiric stranger in the minds of local townspeople. Spring-Heeled Jack, as he was quickly dubbed, aka the Wisconsin vampire, took on a life of his own very quickly. Normally, this is where the being would have taken on an urban legend status and be spoken of thereafter only in hushed tones, passed around in stories among children after lights out. But this would not be the last time that local citizens would have to deal with this creature of the night. This isn't the first time the character known as Spring-Heeled Jack had appeared in the human psyche. His presence dates farther back than 1981. Jack is an entity primarily attributed to English folklore, rising in prominence in the Victorian era. The first of his supposed sightings occurred in 1837. According to many accounts, on October 20th, 1837, a girl named Mary Stevens was walking past a local estate named Lavender Hill. She was working as a servant in this palatial mansion. On her way through Clapham Commons, a strange figure leapt at her from a dark alley. After immobilizing her with a tight grip, he began to kiss her face. While ripping her clothes and touching her flesh with what seemed to be like claws, the man whispered in her in a tongue not known to this earth. Panicked, Mary Stevens screamed, gaining the attention of a few passerbys. As the commotion rose, the attacker fled into the night, sensing that he would be quickly outnumbered. Would-be do-gooders immediately launched a search for the aggressor, but could not find him. The next day, a second witness came forward saying that they had seen the character leap over a massive wall after being chased by the townsfolk. Additionally, multiple eyewitnesses claimed that the man had attacked a second woman later that evening. However, he was interrupted when a passing carriage careened toward him after its driver began to lose control. He leapt in the air, they claimed, close to 9 feet. The driver of the coach then fully lost control, crashing into a nearby structure and severely injuring multiple people. The strange shadowy figure escaped completely unharmed again. Many of the witnesses claimed to have heard a high-pitched, ringing laughter as Jack fled into the night. Gradually, this news of a strange, otherworldly vampiric creature who obsessed over young women and had a penchant for leaping upwards of 10 feet into the air took on a life of its own. He became a legend, plain and simple. This character was quickly given the name Spring-Heeled Jack and was said to have appeared multiple times over the decades that ensued. In 1867, a serial novelization of his excursions called Spring-Heeled Jack, The Terror of London, was published in a local newspaper. Additionally, the character was the star of a penny dreadful released in 1886 and simply titled Spring-Heeled Jack. This was largely due to the second sighting in 1872. Was this manic leaping assailant the same individual spotted in Wisconsin almost 100 years later? Or was this a copycat criminal, inspired by the same English folklore? These questions still plague those who are fascinated by the creature in question. Believe it or not, the 1981 sighting that chilled residents of Mineral Point to the bone was not the only time the waif-like specter raised his high cheekboned head. The tale of the Mineral Point vampire gained a massive cultural resurgence in 2004, when a second appearance of the supposed vampire took the public imagination by storm. On a seemingly calm and clear night, local Mineral Point police received a call saying a man in black was stalking the residents of a recently built apartment complex. Frantic eyewitnesses claimed that there was a foul-smelling figure, garbed in all black, jumping down at passerbys from a tree and attacking them. Police officers who ended up responding to a series of reports later detailed an interaction where they did, in fact, find a man perched in a tree outside of the apartment complex in question. His ominous shadow sat still among the leaves for a few minutes as the officers attempted to communicate with him. Then, he abruptly leapt from the branches and fled. The authorities pursued at breakneck pace, only to quickly realize that this was no ordinary man, but something far more sinister. As they attempted to keep up with their target, they were shocked to realize just how long his legs actually were. They seemed almost inhuman. The subject glanced back at the two officers and gave them a toothy grin, his blood-red eyes twinkling with malice before rounding a corner. The officers followed, only to discover a dead end with footprints leading up to a 15-foot wall and stopping right before it. The similarities of this event to previous sightings of the cryptid sparked much debate about the return of the Wisconsin vampire. The Mineral Point vampire lay dormant for 4 years after the interaction with the Wisconsin's finest, but perhaps feeling emboldened after these 2 escapes, he did eventually resurface for a 3rd time. This time, instead of stalking prey out in the open, the so-called vampire chose to pursue his victims from a more protected location. A man and woman who were spending their free time fishing actually heard the vampire before they spotted him. A rustling and fumbling sound crept up from the brush behind them. They turned around to see nothing. Then they jumped in horror as he suddenly lurched up from under the jetty they were standing on. But the vampire came to a quick realization after initial shock wore off. He had misjudged these potential victims, one of whom was a large and physically imposing man named Brandon Hines. In a moment of pure instinct, Hines tried to defend himself and his girlfriend by throwing a flashlight at the vampire, who stopped advancing out of confusion. Then, realizing just how physically strange this possibly undead man was, he fled to his car, which enabled the couple to make a speedy getaway just seconds before the vampire regained his wits and attempted to enact his revenge. After this potentially life-threatening incident, the two called the police, and the Mineral Point Investigative Division of Those Boys in Blue received a 3rd chance to solve the vampire mystery that had plagued their township for over 30 years. Brandon Hines and Jamie Marker reported their run-in with the town's scariest resident soon after they reached civilization, and an investigation was immediately launched. Upon returning to the site of the encounter, the first thing the police noticed was that their fishing gear was sitting undisturbed by the jetty. The vampire, if there was one, had clearly not touched the equipment at all. But in a confounding twist to the situation, the flashlight which Brandon had used to halt the creature in its tracks was gone. You might find yourself asking then, did the vampire take it? And if so, why? Those are good questions, but we'll probably never know the answer. Today, Mineral Point is not a particularly well-known geographic destination, nor a place that many people have a strong desire to visit, though the history of the place is full of small-town drama and politics, and more than your average amount of paranormal happenings. The population of Mineral Point hit its all-time high in 1870 at 3,275 people. Shortly thereafter, people started moving away in large numbers. This exodus appears to be closely linked to the multiple sightings of the Ridgeway Phantom, the headless horseman who precedes the Wisconsin vampire as Mineral Point's premier ghoul. The number of people living in the town only continued to dwindle with each spectral anomaly its residents reported, and by the time 1980 and the Wisconsin vampire rolled around, its population was close to just 1,000 people. This leaves us with a few lingering questions, doesn't it? Have the residents of Mineral Point found something in the shadows of this sleepy small town? Something eternal? Something that appears to have fangs, blood-red eyes, and the ability to leap 10 straight feet into the air? Or has this creature who's terrorized these Wisconsin residents for close to 40 years just been a harmless trickster this whole time? We'll probably never know. So, what do you think? Were these people who were maybe just a bit too accustomed to bizarre sightings overzealous in their reports of otherworldly creatures? Does the legend of Spring-Heeled Jack play into the Wisconsin vampire on a deeper level? Was this creature of the night simply a man, or something much more? As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to The Graveyard Shift for all your horror needs, and let us know what true life stories you want to learn about next time on Scream to Scream.